That's a
thing?
very good question. I like that. You've answered the question.
Steven Spielberg never raises his voice on set. He doesn't fight for attention, doesn't over-explain, doesn't chase control. He watches, he listens, and then he chooses. Once that choice is made, it almost never changes. That's the part people miss. The hardest thing for a director at Spielberg's level isn't getting what he wants. It's knowing exactly what he wants before the camera ever rolls. For over 5 decades, Spielberg has shaped how movies feel. Not just how they look, but how they land in your chest. He's built worlds, rewritten history, and created characters that outlive the actors who played them. But behind the spectacle, behind the scale, there's a quieter pattern hiding in plain sight. Spielberg doesn't trust many people, and when he does, he gives them something most actors never get from a director like him: silence. He doesn't cast noise, he casts gravity. Actors who don't fight the frame, who don't demand attention, who understand rhythm, restraint, and emotional weight. When Spielberg finds someone like that, he doesn't rotate them out for the next trend. He holds on. Sometimes for decades, sometimes for just one film. But the ones who earn that trust never really leave his orbit. Because these aren't just collaborations, they're anchors, performances that steady the chaos, ground the spectacle, and quietly carry the emotional core of everything you remember. Spielberg has worked with hundreds of actors, but only a handful ever changed how he directs, how he paces a scene, or how much control he's willing to give up. And once you see who those actors are, and why they mattered, you start to understand something deeper about Spielberg himself. Because the people he trusts most on screen are the same ones who shaped the stories that stayed with us long after the credits rolled. When Steven Spielberg works with Tom Hanks, nothing feels accidental. This isn't a director hiring a movie star. It's a filmmaker returning to someone who stabilizes the entire story. From Saving Private Ryan to Catch Me If You Can, The Terminal, Bridge of Spies, and The Post, Hanks isn't just present. He's structural. He's the emotional load-bearing wall. What makes this partnership rare isn't chemistry or friendship. It's trust without supervision. Spielberg has said he gives Hanks almost no direction. A glance, a quiet note, sometimes nothing at all. Because Hanks doesn't chase moments, he finds them. He understands when to pull back, when to let silence speak, and when to ground chaos with restraint. On Saving Private Ryan, surrounded by noise, violence, and scale, Hanks never competes with the spectacle. He absorbs it. His Captain Miller doesn't lead with speeches or bravado. He leads with fatigue, doubt, and moral weight. Spielberg knew the film would collapse emotionally if that performance tipped even slightly toward heroism. Hanks kept it human. That's the pattern. In The Post, Hanks steps into a newsroom not as a firebrand, but as pressure. In Bridge of Spies, he plays decency without decoration. Spielberg once said watching Hanks work is like watching gravity do its job. You don't notice it until it's gone. Other actors bring energy. Hanks brings balance. There's a reason Spielberg keeps circling back. Hanks never tries to impress him. He doesn't adjust his performance to be memorable. He arrives prepared, ego buried, and lets the story breathe. That kind of consistency is rare at any level of Hollywood, let alone at the top. This isn't collaboration anymore, it's calibration. Hanks gives Spielberg emotional oxygen. Spielberg gives Hanks legacy, and every time they work together, the trust deepens. Not louder, not flashier, just quieter and more permanent. But Spielberg's trust doesn't always last decades. Sometimes it only takes one performance to change everything. When Steven Spielberg cast Daniel Day-Lewis as Abraham Lincoln, he wasn't filling a role. He was inviting something he couldn't fully control. This wasn't traditional casting, it was surrender. Day-Lewis didn't audition. He didn't workshop scenes or test interpretations. By the time he arrived on set, Lincoln was already there. The voice, the posture, the pauses. Spielberg later admitted there were moments he forgot he was directing a movie at all. He felt like he was witnessing history unfold in real time. And for a director known for precision and command, that was unfamiliar territory. Spielberg didn't give notes the way he normally would. He didn't joke between takes. He didn't even use first names. On set, Daniel Day-Lewis was addressed as Mr. President, not as a gimmick, but as protection. The performance needed space, not interference. What made this collaboration different wasn't intensity, it was restraint. Lincoln doesn't dominate the screen with speeches or spectacle. The power lives in breath, hesitation, and silence. Day-Lewis turned stillness into tension, and Spielberg, for once, stepped back and let it happen. Getting him wasn't easy. Day-Lewis had turned Spielberg down before. It took years of patience, persuasion, and timing for him to say yes, but when he did, the result was singular. Lincoln became one of Spielberg's most respected films. Day-Lewis won the Oscar. And Spielberg didn't celebrate it like a triumph. He talked about it like a gift. "I didn't direct him," Spielberg said later. "I just witnessed him." That line says everything, because Spielberg doesn't give up control lightly. But some performances don't want guidance. They want trust. Day-Lewis never returned to Spielberg's orbit after that film. Not because of fallout, not because of distance, but because lightning like that doesn't repeat. One role, one moment, one collaboration that permanently shifted how Spielberg understood silence, pacing, and character. And next, there's someone who didn't bend time. He defined movement itself. Before Harrison Ford, action heroes didn't bleed. They didn't wince. They didn't look exhausted when the fight was over. Spielberg saw that flaw immediately, and Ford became the correction. To Spielberg, Ford was never just Indiana Jones. He was a compass, an actor who understood instinctively when to push forward and when to get out of the way. Their collaboration didn't rely on speeches or swagger. It relied on presence, the kind that fills the frame without demanding it. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, Ford rewrote what a leading man could be. He got hit. He failed. He improvised. The famous moments weren't polished. They were human. Spielberg trusted that. He let Ford shape scenes through timing and physical honesty rather than direction-heavy precision. The result was a hero who felt real even when the situations weren't. That trust deepened over time. On The Last Crusade, the shoot was punishing. Long days, physical strain, constant pressure. Ford insisted on doing dangerous work himself, not to prove anything, but because it felt honest. Spielberg later said that when Ford committed, the entire crew locked in. Confidence on screen became confidence on set. What sets Ford apart isn't versatility. It's reliability. He doesn't negotiate with the camera. He doesn't chase approval. He shows up, hits the mark emotionally and physically, and leaves the noise behind. Spielberg has said Ford brings authenticity on demand, humor without winking, toughness without posturing, silence without emptiness. They return to each other again and again, not because of nostalgia, but because Ford never broke the spell. Even decades later, Spielberg has said if he ever made another true adventure film, there's still only one face that comes to mind. Harrison Ford doesn't steal scenes, he defines them. And for Spielberg, that kind of presence isn't just useful, it's foundational. But gravity doesn't always come from strength or experience. Sometimes it comes from precision. When Steven Spielberg first met Leonardo DiCaprio, he didn't see a heartthrob, he saw control. At a moment when the world was still stuck on Titanic, Spielberg looked past the hype and noticed something sharper, timing, restraint, and an actor who never wasted a beat. Catch Me If You Can wasn't designed to reshape DiCaprio's image, but it did exactly that. Beneath the charm and confidence, Spielberg pulled out desperation. Frank Abagnale Jr. wasn't a smooth con artist. He was a kid running from a broken home in a perfect suit. DiCaprio played the mask and the fracture underneath it at the same time. And Spielberg let the contradiction breathe. What impressed Spielberg most wasn't the performance. It was the process. He said DiCaprio reads scenes like blueprints. He asks questions no one else thinks to ask. He understands rhythm instinctively. On set, there was no drama, no second guessing, no ego, just clean collaboration. Take after take, DiCaprio landed exactly where the scene needed to end. That film changed how Hollywood saw him. But it also surprised Spielberg. He later said Leo had an internal clock, an ability to sense when a moment had peaked and when to pull back. That kind of awareness is rare, especially in someone carrying that much attention. There were whispers of more. A Howard Hughes project, a courtroom drama. Schedules shifted. Timing collapsed. The collaborations never happened, but Spielberg never stopped talking about him. He's praised DiCaprio's later work openly, calling performances devastating, fearless, and deeply controlled. That's why this partnership still feels unfinished. One film, endless potential. DiCaprio is one of the few actors Spielberg still speaks about like an open door. Because when Leo entered his orbit, he proved something Spielberg already believed. Even legends can be caught off guard. And sometimes admiration takes decades before it finally finds its moment. Steven Spielberg waited nearly 40 years to direct Meryl Streep, not because the opportunity never came, but because the moment never felt right. When it finally happened, it wasn't planned. It was urgent. The post came together fast, racing real-world headlines. Streep joined late, stepping into the role of Katharine Graham with almost no runway. And somehow, it felt like she'd been preparing for it her entire life. There was no grand entrance, no performance announcing itself. She simply existed inside the frame. That's what stunned Spielberg. He later said directing Streep felt like conducting a symphony with a single instrument. Every glance was deliberate. Every pause carried weight. She didn't push emotion outward. She let it surface on its own. Spielberg gave her space, and she led through stillness. For the first time in his career, Spielberg admitted he felt nervous directing an actor. Not intimidated, careful. He understood that over-directing would break something fragile. Streep didn't need notes to heighten a moment. She needed silence to let it arrive. Her Katharine Graham wasn't loud or forceful. Power crept in slowly. A woman learning, in real time, that the room belonged to her. Streep undercut every scene instead of dominating it, and Spielberg shaped the film around that restraint. The result was another Oscar nomination, but that wasn't what mattered. What lingered was how Spielberg talked about her afterward. He didn't call her impressive, he called her essential, not just to the film, to cinema itself. He compared her precision to Daniel Day-Lewis, internal, surgical, deeply human. They've only worked together once, and that was enough. Spielberg has said he'd drop anything to collaborate with her again. Because some partnerships don't need repetition. They just need perfect timing. But not every bond Spielberg formed came from control or restraint. One came from chaos. Robin Williams was the one element Steven Spielberg never tried to control, and that's exactly why he mattered. When they worked together on Hook, Spielberg was under pressure unlike anything he'd faced before. The production was massive, behind schedule, and emotionally draining. For a director who thrives on structure, the chaos was suffocating. And Robin noticed. According to Spielberg, Williams would call him almost every night after shooting. Not to talk about scenes, not to complain, just to make him laugh. 15 minutes of pure improv. Voices, bits, nonsense. No agenda, no ego, just presence. In the middle of one of the most stressful shoots of his career, Robin became the release valve. On screen, Williams brought something unexpected to Peter Pan. Sadness. This wasn't a fairy tale hero frozen in joy. This was an adult who'd forgotten how to be light. Spielberg saw that ache immediately. It turned a glossy fantasy into something personal. Messy, emotional, imperfect. Spielberg has admitted Hook didn't turn out the way he hoped. Too big, too loose. too unfocused. But when he talks about that film, he never talks about box office or criticism. He talks about Robin, about the way the room changed when he walked in, about the energy he left behind when he wasn't there. Their collaboration never repeated. Not because it failed, but because it couldn't be replicated. Williams wasn't a system, he was an event. Spielberg, who builds worlds through control and planning, allowed Robin to be the one unpredictable force in his frame. After Robin's passing, Spielberg spoke openly about how deeply it affected him. He said the light in the room dimmed. That's not the language of a director talking about an actor. That's a man talking about someone who changed him. Some performances echo long after the camera stops rolling. Some people leave a shape in the air. And when Spielberg talks about actors who truly altered his creative life, he always circles back to Robin, not because he was the most polished, but because he was the most alive. Steven Spielberg never talks about favorites, not because he doesn't have them, but because that's not how he sees actors. He doesn't collect names, he collects moments. Sometimes that moment lasts a lifetime, like it did with Tom Hanks. Sometimes it lasts one film, like Daniel Day-Lewis or Meryl Streep. Sometimes it's unfinished, like Leonardo DiCaprio. And sometimes it's chaos you can never recreate, like Robin Williams. But in every case, the pattern is the same. These actors didn't just perform for Spielberg. They gave him reflection. In their silence, he found tension. In their restraint, he found rhythm. In their presence, he found balance. They didn't fight the frame or demand attention. They understood weight, timing, gravity. Spielberg doesn't cast for noise. He casts for trust, for people who let the work speak without forcing it, people who can carry emotion without explaining it. When he finds that, he doesn't chase trends or swap them out for the next headline. He holds on, or remembers them forever. That's why these collaborations feel different. They aren't transactional. They're permanent, even when they only happen once, because the influence doesn't end with the credits. It lives on in how Spielberg paces a scene, frames a silence, or lets a moment breathe. So when you think about Spielberg's films, the ones that stayed with you, you're probably remembering more than a story or a shot. You're remembering a performance that anchored everything around it. And that's the quiet truth behind his choices. He never needed to name favorites. The work already did it for him.